For 438 days, the world believed he was dead. His family mourned him. His friends accepted he would never come home. Search teams gave up. The Pacific Ocean had swallowed countless fishermen before him, and everyone assumed he'd become another name lost beneath its waves. But more than 14 months later, a small boat drifted onto the shore of a remote island. Inside sat a man with tangled hair, skin burned almost black by the sun, ribs visible beneath his body, barely able to stand. He had no engine, no food, no water, no navigation equipment, no hope, yet somehow he was still alive. This is the unbelievable true story of Jose Salvador Alvarenga, the fisherman who survived 438 days alone in the Pacific Ocean. A story so extraordinary that many people refuse to believe it actually happened. Jose Salvador Alvarenga never imagined that the ordinary fishing trip he had made countless times before would become one of the greatest survival stories in modern history. He wasn't a famous explorer, a trained survival expert, or someone preparing to challenge nature. He was simply a hard-working fisherman trying to earn enough money to support himself through another difficult season. Like thousands of fishermen across the Pacific coast, he knew the sea could be dangerous. Storms came without warning. Boats disappeared. Men were lost forever. It was an accepted risk of profession, one that every fisherman silently carried with him each time he left the shore. But on one November morning in 2012, the Pacific Ocean had something far more terrifying in store than anyone could have imagined. What was supposed to be a routine fishing expedition, lasting less than 24 hours, slowly turned into an endless nightmare with no rescue, no communication, and no certainty that another human being would ever see him alive again. The ocean is unlike any other place on Earth. In the middle of the Pacific, there are no roads, no mountains, no lights in the distance, and no landmarks to guide the lost. Every direction looks exactly the same. Day after day, the horizon never changes. The sun rises. The sun sets. Waves continue without mercy. Time itself begins to lose meaning. Most people struggle to imagine surviving a single week without food or fresh water. Very few could endure an entire month. Jose Salvador Alvarenga would face something almost impossible to comprehend. 438 days. More than 14 months drifting across one of the largest oceans on the planet. He would battle violent storms powerful enough to flip fishing boats in seconds. He would suffer unbearable thirst beneath a relentless tropical sun. He would hunt with his bare hands because there was nothing else left to eat. He would watch hope disappear one sunrise after another, wondering whether death would arrive today or tomorrow. Even more devastating than hunger or exhaustion was the loneliness. There were no voices, no conversations, no rescue plans, no ships on the horizon, nothing except the endless sound of wind and water. Many experts later admitted that isolation alone destroys the human mind long before the body finally gives up. Yet somehow, against every logical expectation, Alvarenga kept finding another reason to survive one more day. When he finally appeared on the shore of a tiny island over a year later, those who saw him could hardly believe their own eyes. His body was alive, but almost everything familiar about the man had been stripped away by the ocean. His story spread across the world almost immediately. Some called it a miracle. Others called it impossible. A few even accused him of inventing the entire ordeal. But as investigators carefully reconstructed his journey using weather records, ocean currents, satellite data, and eyewitness testimony, the incredible truth slowly emerged. This is not merely the story of surviving hunger or storms. It is the story of what remains inside a human being after almost every comfort, certainty, and expectation has been taken away. It is the story of how determination can continue long after hope itself seems to have disappeared. And before we begin retracing every step of this extraordinary journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Here, we uncover remarkable true stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary moments in history, stories that deserve to be remembered, no matter how much time has passed. Now, let's return to the morning when Jose Salvador Alvarenga climbed into a small fishing boat, believing he would be home before the next sunrise. On the Pacific coast of southern Mexico, fishing was more than a profession. It was a way of life that had been passed down through generations. Small communities depended almost entirely on the sea. Every morning before sunrise, dozens of weather boats left the beaches carrying men who understood that every trip involved a silent agreement with nature. They knew they could return with enough fish to feed their family for weeks, or they might not return at all. The ocean gave generously, but it demanded respect. Jose Salvador Alvarenga had lived that reality for years. Originally from El Salvador, he had crossed the border into Mexico searching for opportunities that were becoming increasingly difficult to find in his homeland. Like many migrants, he accepted the hardest jobs available. Fishing was physically exhausting, unpredictable, and dangerous, but offered something precious: the chance to earn honest living through relentless work. Those who knew him described him as energetic, confident, and remarkably experienced at sea. He possessed an instinct that many fishermen admired. He could often predict where the best catches would be found, and he had developed an unusual ability to remain calm even when the weather became difficult. While others panicked during rough waves, Alvarenga trusted his experience. That confidence had served him well for years. Life, however, was far from comfortable. The work was seasonal. Income fluctuated constantly, and every successful trip simply allowed him to continue surviving. There were no guarantees. Some weeks brought excellent catches. Others barely covered fuel costs. Yet despite the hardships, he continued returning to the ocean because there were few alternatives. In November 2012, the fishing season promised another opportunity. Demand was good, and larger catches could provide enough income to ease financial pressures. Boats left almost daily whenever weather conditions appeared favorable. Fishermen constantly watched the sky, studied the winds, and listened carefully to local forecasts before deciding whether it was worth taking the risk. On the morning of November 17th, Alvarenga prepared for what everyone expected to be another ordinary expedition. His employer assigned him a fiberglass fishing boat, roughly 25 feet long. It was sturdy enough for offshore fishing, but still small compared to the immense Pacific Ocean surrounding it. The boat carried an outboard engine, fuel, fishing equipment, large insulated containers for storing fish, a radio for communication, and supplies expected to last less than a day. Originally, another experienced fisherman had planned to accompany him, but shortly before departure, that man decided not to go. Weather reports hinted that conditions might deteriorate later in the day. It wasn't unusual for fishermen to postpone trips when storms were possible. Many believed waiting 24 hours was simply the smarter decision. Finding a replacement on short notice proved difficult. Eventually, a much younger fisherman named Ezequiel Cordoba agreed to join the trip. Cordoba had far less experience than Alvarenga, but he was eager to work. The opportunity meant valuable income, and with Alvarenga's reputation as a capable fisherman, the journey seemed manageable despite the uncertain forecast. Before sunrise, the two men loaded bait, fishing lines, ice, fuel, and equipment into the small vessel. The sky appeared calm enough. Clouds drifted lazily across the horizon, and nothing suggested that within hours they would be facing one of the most violent storms either man had ever experienced. As the engine roared to life, the boat slowly pulled away from the coast. Behind them, the shoreline gradually disappeared into the morning haze. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of open Pacific Ocean. Neither man realized that this simple departure would become the final moment they would ever experience anything resembling an ordinary life. For Jose Salvador Alvarenga, every familiar routine ended the instant that little boat crossed beyond the breakers. The ocean had already begun writing a completely different story. At first, everything unfolded exactly as expected. The Pacific was alive with activity. Schools of fish moved beneath the surface. Seabirds circled overhead searching for easy meals, and the gentle rhythm of the waves gave no indication that danger was rapidly approaching. Alvarenga and Cordoba settled into familiar routines shared by fishermen around the world. They baited hooks, cast long fishing lines, checked equipment, and slowly filled the insulated containers with their catch. Hour after hour, the work continued successfully. By midday, they had caught hundreds of kilograms of fish, including sharks, tuna, and other valuable species. It was the kind of day fishermen hoped for. Every fish represented income, and by all appearances, the trip would be considered complete success. If they returned before nightfall, both men would earn more than they expected. But while they focused on the water around them, the sky beyond the horizon was quietly changing. Dark clouds began gathering in the distance. The wind shifted. The wave became slightly taller. To inexperienced eyes, the changes might have seemed insignificant, but Alvarenga immediately noticed them. Years spent at sea had taught him that the Pacific often whispered before it screamed. Storms rarely announced themselves all at once. They built patiently, layer by layer, until escape became impossible. He looked toward the coastline. It was already difficult to see. The weather had moved in much faster than forecast. Alvarenga decided it was time to head home. The two men secured their equipment and started the outboard engine. The boat turned toward shore, cutting through increasingly rough water. At first, progress seemed normal, although slower than expected. But within minutes, the wind intensified dramatically. Rain began falling. Then it poured. Visibility collapsed. The coastline disappeared completely behind a gray curtain of water. The ocean transformed into chaos. Massive waves slammed against the small fiberglass boat from every direction. The bow rose violently before crashing into deep troughs that filled the vessel with seawater. Every impact shook the boat so hard that Cordoba struggled to remain standing. Alvarenga gripped the steering handle tightly. He had survived storms before. His plan was simple: keep the bow pointed into the waves and continue moving toward land. Then something happened that changed everything. The engine began sputtering. For a few terrifying seconds, it lost power. It recovered, then failed again. Salt water, relentless pounding, and mechanical strain were taking their toll. Finally, the engine died. Silence lasted only a heartbeat before the storm swallowed every other sound. Without propulsion, the little boat immediately lost control. The waves dictated its direction. Each swell pushed them farther from shore instead of closer to it. Alvarenga pulled repeatedly on the starter cord. Nothing. Again. Nothing. Again. The engine refused to respond. Now, they weren't simply fishermen caught in bad weather. They were two men trapped inside an unpowered boat in one of the largest oceans on Earth. Desperately, Alvarenga reached for the radio. Static. He adjusted the frequency. More static. Finally, a weak signal broke through. He managed to contact his employer, speaking over deafening wind and crashing waves. He explained their position, reported that the engine had failed, and pleaded for assistance before the radio signal faded beneath interference. His employer immediately contacted local rescue authorities. But there was one enormous problem. The coordinates Alvarenga transmitted were only approximate. The storm was already pushing the boat farther away every minute. And without an engine, there was absolutely nothing the two fishermen could do to stop it. As darkness slowly approached, the Pacific Ocean grew even more violent. The search had begun, but Jose Salvador Alvarenga and Ezequiel Cordoba were already drifting into one of the most unforgiving stretches of open water on the planet. The rescue operation began almost immediately. Along the coast, everyone assumed the missing boat would be found within hours. Fishermen were occasionally delayed by storms. Engines failed from time to time, and many rescues ended successfully once the weather improved. No one imagined that this disappearance would become one of the longest survival stories ever recorded. Search boats left the harbor as soon as conditions allowed. Aircraft scanned the ocean from above. The Mexican Navy joined the effort. Alvarenga's employer remained in constant contact with the authorities, providing every detail he could remember about the planned route, the fishing grounds, and the approximate position from the last radio transmission. But the Pacific Ocean had already erased almost every trace. The storm continued driving the disabled boat farther offshore with astonishing speed. Powerful currents that neither fisherman could see beneath the surface quietly carried them westward, away from Mexico, away from shipping lanes, and away from the areas where rescuers concentrated their search. Inside the boat, the situation became increasingly desperate. Rain lashed their faces. Towering waves crashed over sides. Every few minutes they were forced to scoop seawater out with buckets and plastic containers simply to keep the boat from filling completely. The exhausting routine never stopped. Empty the water. Brace for another wave. Empty the water again. Neither man slept. Neither man could. The storm demanded every ounce of their attention. If they stopped removing water, even briefly, the boat could become too heavy and sink beneath them. As daylight faded into another dark night, Cordoba began asking questions that Alvarenga struggled to answer. "Do you think they'll find us?" Alvarenga wanted to say yes. He wanted to reassure the younger man that rescue boats would appear at sunrise, that helicopters would eventually spot them, that someone somewhere would see their drifting vessel. But experience told him something different. He had spent enough years on the ocean to understand how terrifyingly small a fishing boat becomes once it loses sight of land. A helicopter flying only a few miles away might never notice them. A ship could pass over the horizon without anyone aboard realizing two men were desperately waving for help. Still, he refused to surrender hope. "They're looking for us," he said. "We just have to stay alive until they get here." Those words became their first survival strategy. Not surviving for weeks, not surviving for months, just surviving until tomorrow. The following morning, the storm finally weakened. The sky cleared enough for sunlight to break through the clouds. For the first time since losing the engine, both men stood and searched the horizon carefully. Nothing. No rescue boats. No helicopters. No coastline. No other fishing vessels. Only water in every direction. The realization struck them with terrifying force. They were completely alone. Alvarenga attempted to repair the engine one final time. He checked fuel lines, examined connections, cleaned what he could, and repeatedly pulled the starter cord until his hands blistered. The engine never fired. Without propulsion, the currents continued carrying them deeper into the Pacific. Hours later, they spotted something in the distance. Both men jumped to their feet, shouting with excitement. A ship. It was real. The enormous vessel slowly crossed the horizon several miles away. They screamed. They waved shirts. They raised fishing equipment into the air. But the ship never changed course. It continued moving steadily until it disappeared beyond the horizon. Whether no one saw them, or whether they were simply too far away, they would never know. As the sun disappeared for another evening, Cordoba finally voiced the fear that both men had been trying to ignore. What if nobody ever comes? For the first time since the nightmare began, neither of them had an answer. The fourth day at sea marked a turning point. Until then, both men had clung to the belief that rescue was only a matter of time. Every sunrise had brought renewed hope that a helicopter would appear overhead or that another fishing boat would emerge from the horizon. But as the days passed in complete silence, reality began replacing optimism. Their food supply was nearly gone. The drinking water they had packed for what should have been a single day's work had already been rationed as carefully as possible. Each sip became a difficult decision. Drink too much now, and tomorrow there would be nothing left. Drink too little, and dehydration would weaken them even faster. The tropical sun showed no mercy. Without shade, the fiberglass boat became an oven during the day. The deck grew so hot that touching it with bare skin became painful. Their lips cracked until they bled. Salt from the ocean dried across their faces and clothes, burning every small cut caused by ropes, hooks, and constant exposure to seawater. At night, the opposite problem arrived. The temperature dropped sharply. Soaked by waves and rain, they shivered uncontrollably beneath an open sky. They had no blankets, no shelter, and no way to escape the cold wind sweeping endlessly across the Pacific. Sleep became almost impossible. Every unexpected wave threatened to throw them into the ocean. Even when exhaustion forced them to close their eyes for a few minutes, they woke instantly at the sound of water crashing against the hull. Their bodies were beginning to fail, but their minds faced an even greater challenge. Time moved strangely at sea. Without clocks, schedules, or familiar routines, every day blended into next. Sunrise, heat, hunger, sunset, darkness, repeat. The endless cycle slowly erased any clear sense of how long they had actually been drifting. On what they believed was the fifth day, Alvarenga made a decision that would ultimately save his life. The rain returned briefly. Instead of complaining about the storm, he grabbed every empty container he could find. Plastic bottles, buckets, coolers, even pieces of fishing equipment capable of holding water. The fresh rain became more valuable than anything else on the boat. Both men drank deeply, lifting their faces toward the sky, as if the rain itself had become a miracle. They collected every possible drop before the clouds disappeared once again. That moment taught Alvarenga an important lesson. The ocean could not provide fresh water, but the sky sometimes could. From then on, every dark cloud became a source of hope instead of fear. Food presented an even greater problem. The fish they had caught before the storm were no longer usable. Without ice capable of preserving them for long, most had spoiled quickly beneath the relentless heat. Throwing away hundreds of pounds of fish felt almost unimaginable only days earlier. Now they watched their only food disappear into the sea. Hunger tightened its grip. At first they tried nibbling tiny pieces of bait left inside the boat. Then they searched every storage compartment for forgotten scraps. Nothing remained. Alvarenga stared into the clear blue water surrounding them. Fish swam beneath the boat. Birds occasionally landed nearby. Life surrounded them, yet almost none of it was within reach. The irony was cruel. They were starving while floating above one of the richest ecosystems on Earth. Then instinct took over. Using nothing more than his bare hands, fishing hooks, and the equipment already aboard, Alvarenga began trying to catch whatever came close enough. Small fish, flying fish that accidentally landed inside the boat, sea birds resting for only a few seconds. Anything edible, anything that could postpone starvation. It was no longer about preference. It was about survival. Every successful catch meant one more day alive. Every missed opportunity meant growing weaker. The ocean had stripped away comfort, certainty, and routine. Now it was teaching them humanity's oldest lesson. When survival becomes the only goal, every sunrise is earned. By the second week, survival was no longer about waiting. It had become a daily occupation. Every morning, Jose Salvador Alvarenga woke with the same questions. Would it rain today? Would they catch anything to eat? Would they see another ship? Every answer determined whether they would live through another sunset. The ocean had reduced life to its simplest form. Nothing else mattered. Money meant nothing. Plans meant nothing. The future barely existed. Only the next few hours carried any meaning. Alvarenga quickly realized that conserving energy was just as important as finding food. Every unnecessary movement burned precious calories that were becoming impossible to replace. They stopped talking as much. They remained seated whenever possible. Every action became slow, deliberate, and calculated. Even fishing changed. Traditional methods required bait, patience, and equipment they could no longer afford to waste. Instead, Alvarenga watched the ocean itself. Flying fish occasionally launched themselves from the water to escape predators. During the night, some accidentally landed inside the small fiberglass boat. Whenever he heard the unmistakable sound of something striking the deck, he immediately lunged toward it before the fish could flip back into the sea. Those unexpected visitors became lifesavers. Raw and slippery, they provided protein, moisture, and enough energy to keep both men functioning. Soon he began catching larger fish using improvised techniques. With extraordinary patience, he lowered simple hand lines into the water and waited. Sometimes hours passed without success. Sometimes luck rewarded them. When they managed to catch a fish, there was no fire, no cooking, no seasoning, no clean plates. They tore the flesh apart with their hands and ate it exactly as it came from the ocean. At first, Cordoba struggled. The taste made him nauseous. The texture was unfamiliar. Everything inside him resisted eating raw flesh. But hunger eventually defeated disgust. When the body begins starving, survival rewrites every rule. Water remained an even greater concern. Rainstorms became their only reliable source of fresh water, but the weather refused to cooperate consistently. Days often passed beneath cloudless skies, while the tropical sun slowly drained every drop of moisture from their bodies. Desperation forced them to consider options they would once have found unimaginable. Alvarenga knew that drinking seawater could kill them. Its salt concentration would accelerate dehydration, damage their kidneys, and eventually cause hallucinations and organ failure. That option was never truly an option. Instead, they began collecting every possible source of liquid. Rainwater remained the greatest blessing. The blood from freshly caught turtles and fish provided small amounts of hydration. Even the moisture inside raw meat became valuable. Every drop counted. Meanwhile, their appearance changed dramatically. Their skin darkened beneath constant exposure to the sun. Salt dried into white crystals across their bodies. Hair and beard grew wildly. Their fingernails lengthened. Small cuts became infected. Their hands, once strong from years of fishing, developed deep cracks from endless contact with salt water and ropes. When they looked at each other, they barely recognized the men who had left Mexico only days earlier. Psychologically, the isolation became increasingly difficult. There was nothing to distract the mind. No books, no music, no radio, no conversations beyond the same fears repeated every day. Sometimes they spoke about home, sometimes about favorite meals, sometimes about people they hoped to see again. Those conversations served an important purpose. As long as they could still imagine life beyond the boat, they had not completely surrendered to despair. One evening, as the sun disappeared into the endless Pacific, Cordoba quietly asked a question that neither of them had dared to consider before. If nobody finds us... He paused. How long do you think a person can survive out here? Alvarenga looked toward the horizon. It was as empty as it had been every single day. He wanted to offer hope. He wanted to invent an encouraging answer. But this time, even he didn't know what to believe. By the third week, the ocean no longer felt like a place. It felt like an entire world. Jose Salvador Alvarenga had stopped expecting rescue every morning. Hope had not disappeared completely, but it had changed. Instead of believing that someone would arrive today, he began focusing on something much smaller. Survive until sunset, then survive until tomorrow. That simple shift in thinking kept him moving. Ezequiel Cordoba, however, was struggling. The younger fisherman had never imagined a situation like this. He had agreed to what he believed would be a routine fishing trip, not an endless drift across the largest ocean on Earth. Every day seemed to take something away from him, his strength, his confidence, and little by little, his will to continue. The conversations between the two men also began to change. During the first days, they talked constantly about rescue. Now, they talked about memories. Cordoba described meals his mother used to cook. He remembered family gatherings, holidays, and ordinary afternoons that suddenly felt priceless. Things he had never considered special before leaving shore now became treasures inside his mind. Alvarenga listened carefully. He encouraged the younger man to keep talking. As long as Cordoba could remember life on land, there was still something pulling him forward, but the body was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Some days they caught fish. Other days they caught nothing. When fortune smiled, they shared raw fish, turtles, small birds that landed on the boat, and occasionally jellyfish that drifted close enough to collect. Every meal was eaten exactly as nature provided it. Bones, blood, organs. Nothing could be wasted. Even the shells of turtles became useful. They collected rainwater inside them whenever storms passed overhead. Every object aboard the little boat slowly found a new purpose. Nothing remained ordinary anymore. The sea itself became their only source of everything. Food, water, shade, tools, even companionship. Dolphins occasionally appeared beside the boat, swimming effortlessly through the waves. Their presence fascinated Cordoba. For a few brief moments, watching the animals leap through the water distracted him from hunger and fear. Birds landed on the edges of the boat to rest. Sometimes they escaped. Sometimes they became dinner. Sharks circled beneath them more frequently now. Large dark shadows moved silently below the surface. At first, Cordoba panicked whenever he saw them. Alvarenga remained surprisingly calm. The sharks were dangerous, but only if they entered the water. As long as they stayed inside the boat, the predators represented another reminder that nature followed its own rules, completely indifferent to human suffering. One afternoon, heavy rain finally arrived. Both men celebrated as though they had discovered treasure. They laughed for the first time in days. They opened every container they possessed. They drank until their stomachs hurt. For those few precious minutes, survival seemed possible again. But joy disappeared almost as quickly as the clouds. The following days brought relentless sunshine. The collected water slowly diminished. Rationing returned. Then something unexpected happened. Cordoba stopped eating. At first, Alvarenga assumed it was nausea caused by exhaustion. He encouraged him to take small bites. The younger fisherman refused. He said eating raw animals disgusted him. He insisted he would wait until rescue arrived. Alvarenga tried explaining that rescue might not come tomorrow or next week. Their bodies needed food now. Cordoba remained stubborn. Each day he ate less. Each day he became weaker. His cheeks sank. His movements slowed. His voice lost its strength. Watching this frightened Alvarenga more than the storms ever had. He understood something that Cordoba still refused to accept. Out there, nature did not negotiate. It rewarded adaptation, and it punished hesitation without mercy. The decline happened slowly at first. One missed meal became 2, then 3. Jose Salvador Alvarenga continued catching fish whenever he could, placing small portions beside Ezequiel Cordoba and urging him to eat. Sometimes he managed a few bites. More often, he simply shook his head. "I can't." Those words became painfully familiar. Alvarenga argued with him almost every day. "You have to. It doesn't matter if you hate it. If you stop eating, you won't survive." But Cordoba had reached a point where logic no longer mattered. His body rejected the raw meat, and his mind could no longer overcome the disgust. Hunger was no longer the greatest enemy. Despair was. The younger fisherman grew quieter with each passing day. Long stretches passed without a single conversation. He spent hours staring at the endless horizon, as though expecting land to appear simply because he wished for it hard enough. Sometimes he whispered prayers. Sometimes he apologized to his family aloud, believing they would never know what happened to him. Alvarenga listened without interrupting. There were no comforting words left to offer. He had begun noticing something else. Cordoba was becoming dangerously dehydrated. The last rainstorm had been days earlier, and although they still had a small reserve of collected water, it wasn't enough to replace what the tropical sun stole from their bodies each day. Their lips split open. Their tongues swelled. Even speaking became painful. The ocean surrounded them with more water than either man could imagine, yet not a single drop could safely quench their thirst. One afternoon, Cordoba made a decision that terrified Alvarenga. Ignoring every warning, he leaned over the side of the boat and scooped seawater into his hands. Before Alvarenga could stop him, he drank, only a few mouthfuls. But enough. "No!" Alvarenga shouted, grabbing his arm. "Don't ever do that again." Cordoba looked back with exhausted eyes. "I was thirsty. You'll only get thirstier. It'll kill you." Alvarenga knew the science, even if he didn't use scientific words. Every experienced fisherman understood the same lesson. Salt water tricks the body. For a few moments, it feels like relief. Soon afterward, dehydration becomes even worse. Over the following day, Cordoba became noticeably weaker. Whether from dehydration, starvation, exhaustion, or all three combined, his condition continued to deteriorate. He struggled to stand. His balance disappeared. Even lifting his arms required visible effort. Meanwhile, Alvarenga forced himself to continue moving. He fished. He checked the boat. He searched the horizon. He collected anything remotely useful that floated nearby. Abandoned plastic bottles, pieces of driftwood, floating debris carried by distant currents. Anything that might one day help them survive. He understood something that Cordoba had begun to lose. Action kept fear under control. As long as he had another task to complete, his mind had less room for panic. Then came another cruel reminder of how enormous the Pacific truly was. Late one afternoon, they spotted an airplane. It appeared as a tiny silhouette high above the clouds. Both men exploded into motion. They screamed. They waved shirts. They held reflective objects toward the sunlight. For several agonizing minutes, they believed the aircraft was approaching. Instead, it continued across the sky without changing direction. Eventually, it disappeared beyond the horizon. Silence returned. Cordoba lowered his arms first. His shoulders slumped. The last trace of excitement vanished from his face. Without saying a word, he sat back down inside the boat and stared at the floor. Alvarenga watched him carefully. He recognized that expression. It wasn't simple disappointment. It was a look of a man beginning to believe that no one was coming. And once a person truly accepts that, The battle for survival becomes far more dangerous than hunger itself. The human body can endure astonishing punishment. The human mind, however, often reaches its limits first. By now, Jose Salvador Alvarenga had stopped counting the days with certainty. He still scratched marks into parts of the boat whenever he remembered, but storms, exhaustion, and endless repetition had begun to blur time itself. Whether they had been drifting for 3 weeks or over a month hardly mattered anymore. Each sunrise looked identical. Each sunset ended the same way. The Pacific had become an endless circle with no beginning and no end. Ezequiel Cordoba was changing before Alvarenga's eyes. His body had become frighteningly thin. The muscles that once helped him haul heavy fishing nets had almost disappeared. His face looked older, hollow, and permanently exhausted. Even speaking required effort. One morning, Alvarenga handed him a freshly caught fish. Cordoba looked at it for several seconds, then quietly pushed it away. "I don't want it. You have to eat." "I'm tired." "Tired isn't the problem." "I know." His voice had become almost a whisper. Alvarenga forced himself to stay patient. Anger would accomplish nothing. Every day, he tried different approaches. He cut the meat into smaller pieces. He encouraged Cordoba to take just one bite. He reminded him of his family waiting back home. Sometimes the younger fisherman obeyed. Most of the time, he didn't. The psychological burden of survival was crushing him. Meanwhile, Alvarenga fought his own private battle. He also felt hopeless. He also cried when Cordoba wasn't looking. He also wondered whether his family had already accepted that he was dead. But every time those thoughts became overwhelming, he deliberately gave himself another task. Check the fishing lines, clean the boat, look for rain clouds, search the horizon, organize supplies, anything. He instinctively understood something that survival experts often teach today. Routine keeps people alive. As long as the mind has purpose, despair struggles to take complete control. Then another unexpected opportunity appeared. A large sea turtle surfaced beside the drifting boat. Moving carefully, Alvarenga managed to grab it before it disappeared beneath the waves. It became one of the most valuable resources they had found since the storm. The meat provided food. The blood supplied additional moisture. The shell became another container for collecting rainwater. Nothing was wasted. To anyone safely on land, such actions might sound unimaginable. Out there, they were simply practical. Nature had erased every unnecessary rule. Only survival remained. Yet even this blessing failed to lift Cordoba's spirits. He barely touched the turtle meat. He spent more time lying motionless at the bottom of the boat, staring upward into the empty sky. His conversations became increasingly strange. Sometimes he spoke to relatives as though they were sitting beside him. Sometimes he answered questions that no one had asked. Sometimes he smiled at memories only he could see. Alvarenga recognized the danger immediately. Extreme dehydration, starvation, isolation, exhaustion. Together they slowly blur the line between reality and imagination. One afternoon, Cordoba quietly asked, "Do you think they've already buried us?" The question hung in the air. Alvarenga looked toward the endless ocean. Somewhere beyond that horizon, rescue teams had long since ended their search. Families had begun mourning. Friends were trying to move on. To the entire world, they had already disappeared. But Alvarenga refused to say those words aloud. Instead, he answered with the only truth he still believed. As long as we're breathing, our story isn't over. He believed it. He needed to believe it, because if he lost that single thought, the Pacific would take far more than their bodies. The day Ezequiel Cordoba stopped fighting was almost impossible to identify. There was no dramatic moment, no final speech, no sudden collapse. Instead, it happened quietly, as though the ocean itself had slowly extinguished the last spark inside him. Jose Salvador Alvarenga noticed it in the little things first. Cordoba no longer asked what day it was. He stopped scanning the horizon for ships. When rain clouds appeared, he barely reacted. Even when Alvarenga managed to catch fresh fish, the younger man showed almost no interest. His body was still alive, but his determination was fading. Alvarenga refused to accept it. Every morning, he continued encouraging him. You need to eat. You need to drink. We're going to make it. Sometimes Cordoba nodded politely. Other times, he simply closed his eyes. It became painfully clear that starvation was no longer the greatest danger. Hopelessness was. The human body can survive extraordinary hardship when the mind believes there is still a reason to endure. But once that belief disappears, even the strongest body begins to surrender. One afternoon, after hours of silence, Cordoba finally spoke. If I don't make it, Alvarenga interrupted him immediately. Don't talk like that. Listen to me. We're both getting home. But Cordoba continued. If I die, tell my mother I thought about her every day. The word struck Alvarenga harder than any storm. He looked away, pretending to adjust with the fishing lines, so the younger man wouldn't see tears forming in his eyes. I'll tell her yourself, he answered firmly. You'll tell her. For a brief moment, Cordoba smiled. It was a small smile, weak, almost apologetic. Then silence returned. Over the next several days, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He could barely sit upright. His breathing became shallow. His movements slowed until even lifting his head required tremendous effort. Alvarenga did everything he could. He caught fish and placed tiny pieces directly into Cordoba's mouth. He collected rainwater whenever the clouds appeared. He shaded him from the relentless sun, using whatever equipment remained aboard the boat. He spoke constantly, refusing to let the younger fisherman drift into complete silence. He told stories about life in Mexico, about fishing trips that had gone wrong but ended safely, about restaurants they would visit after returning home, about ordinary things, anything that reminded Cordoba there was still a world beyond the endless ocean. But reality was stronger than optimism. One evening, Cordoba quietly confessed something that revealed how deeply despair had taken hold. I keep dreaming that I'm already home. He paused. And then I wake up here. Alvarenga didn't know how to answer because he had begun having similar dreams himself. Sometimes he dreamed he was eating fresh fruit. Sometimes he dreamed he was sleeping in a real bed. Sometimes he dreamed he could hear people talking. The cruelest part was waking up. Every single time. The first thing he saw was the same endless blue horizon, the same broken boat, the same unforgiving Pacific. Days later, Cordoba stopped speaking almost entirely. His eyes remained open, but they rarely focused on anything. He seemed to be looking through the horizon instead of at it. Alvarenga realized that he was witnessing something every survival expert fears. The moment when a person no longer believes survival is possible. And once that belief disappears, the body often follows soon after. As another silent sunset painted the Pacific sky in shades of orange and crimson, Jose Salvador Alvarenga understood that he was no longer fighting only for his own life. He was desperately trying to keep another man's hope alive, and he was beginning to fear he was already too late. The moment Jose Salvador Alvarenga had feared finally arrived. It happened during what seemed like an ordinary morning. The ocean was unusually calm. Gentle waves rocked a little fiberglass boat beneath a cloudless sky, creating the illusion of peace. For a few brief hours, nature stopped attacking them. But inside the boat, another battle had already been lost. Alvarenga leaned toward Ezequiel Cordoba. The young fisherman hadn't moved since dawn. His breathing had become almost impossible to notice. His eyes remained half open, staring toward the endless sky above them. Ezequiel, there was no response. He touched his shoulder gently. Nothing. He called his name again. Silence. For several long seconds, Alvarenga simply watched him, refusing to accept what he already knew. Then he placed his hand against Cordoba's chest. There was no heartbeat. The young fisherman who had climbed aboard full of hope only weeks earlier was gone. Alvarenga sat motionless. He didn't cry immediately. Shock often arrives before grief. His mind refused to process the reality before him. He spoke as though Cordoba could still hear. We made it this far. You can't leave now. We're almost there. Of course. There was no answer. For the first time since the storm began, Jose Salvador Alvarenga found himself completely alone. Not simply isolated. Truly alone. Thousands of miles from land. No radio. No engine, no rescue, no living human being anywhere in sight. Only himself and the body of the friend he had desperately tried to save. The silence became unbearable. For hours he continued speaking to Cordoba. He described the clouds. He commented on the waves. He apologized for not being able to help more. It wasn't madness. Not yet. It was a desperate refusal to accept absolute solitude. As daylight faded, Alvarenga faced a decision that no one should ever have to make. What should he do with Cordoba's body? He couldn't simply throw his companion into the ocean. Emotionally, he wasn't capable of doing it, so he left him where he was. The next morning, he spoke to him again. Then the next. Days passed. He continued holding conversations with a man who could no longer answer. It helped preserve the illusion that he wasn't completely alone. But nature follows its own laws. The tropical heat quickly began changing the body. The smell became overwhelming. Alvarenga tried looking away. He tried pretending nothing had changed. Eventually, he understood he could no longer remain beside the body. With tears running down his face, he whispered a final goodbye. He apologized over and over. He asked for forgiveness. Then, with trembling hands, he gently pushed Cordoba into the Pacific Ocean. The body disappeared beneath the waves. Within seconds, there was nothing left to see. The ocean that had taken everything else had now taken his only companion. Alvarenga watched the empty water for a long time. He had never felt silence like this before. No conversations, no footsteps, no breathing except his own, no evidence that another human being existed anywhere on Earth. That evening, for the first time in his life, Jose Salvador Alvarenga admitted something to himself that he had resisted for weeks. No one was coming. If he survived, he would have to do it alone. The days following the death of Ezequiel Cordoba became the darkest of Jose Salvador Alvarenga's life. Until then, every decision had been shared. Every fear had been witnessed by another person. Every sunrise had been faced together. Now there was only silence, an overwhelming, crushing silence that seemed louder than the crashing waves themselves. For the first few mornings, Alvarenga instinctively turned toward the place where Cordoba had always rested. Each time, the empty space reminded him that he was truly alone. The realization struck him over and over again. There would be no conversations, no encouragement, no one to help collect rainwater, no one to keep watch while he rested. Every task, every decision, every mistake would now belong to him alone. The loneliness became almost physical. He began speaking out loud simply to hear a human voice. Sometimes he talked to himself. Sometimes he spoke to God. Sometimes he addressed the ocean as though it could answer. He described his plans for the day. He complained about the heat. He celebrated when he caught a fish. He apologized whenever he cried. The sound of his own voice became a lifeline. Silence, he discovered, could slowly destroy a person's mind. To avoid losing himself completely, he created routines. Every morning, immediately after sunrise, he inspected the boat for damage. He checked every container that could possibly hold rainwater. He organized his fishing hooks and lines. He looked carefully at the sky, studying clouds that might later bring precious fresh water. Then he searched the horizon. Always the horizon. It had become an obsession. Every tiny dark shape made his heart race. A floating log, a distant wave, a seabird. Sometimes he convinced himself he could see a ship. Minutes later, the illusion disappeared. Still, he continued looking. Hope had become a habit. Around this time, something inside him changed. He stopped asking when rescue would come. Instead, he began asking a different question. What do I need to do today to stay alive? That question transformed everything. He no longer waited passively. He adapted. He improved his fishing techniques, learning exactly where small fish tended to gather beneath the drifting boat. He became remarkably efficient at catching seabirds that landed nearby to rest. Sea turtles became one of his greatest sources of survival. He carefully learned how to capture them without wasting unnecessary energy. Every part served a purpose. The meat became food. The blood provided additional hydration. The shell became a bowl for collecting rainwater. Nothing could be discarded. Nature had reduced survival to pure efficiency. Meanwhile, his own body continued changing. His beard reached his chest. His hair hung in tangled knots across his shoulders. His fingernails thickened and curved. His skin hardened beneath months of relentless sunlight. Looking into calm patches of water, he barely recognized the reflection staring back at him. It looked like someone who had lived his entire life at sea, not the fisherman who had left Mexico months earlier. Sometimes he wondered whether anyone would even recognize him if he somehow returned home. Would his family know his face? Would they believe he was really Jose Salvador Alvarenga? Or would they see only a stranger emerging from the ocean? These thoughts frightened him, not because of vanity, but because they reminded him how much of his old life was disappearing. The Pacific wasn't only testing his body. Little by little, it was erasing the man he used to be. Yet despite everything he had lost, one thing remained untouched. Every single morning, he still chose to survive one more day. Weeks turned into months. Jose Salvador Alvarenga no longer measured time the way people on land did. There were no calendars, no weekends, no holidays, only the endless rhythm of sunrise and sunset. Eventually, he stopped trying to remember the exact date altogether. His world had become astonishingly small. A 25-foot fiberglass boat, the sky above him, the Pacific below him. Everything else had disappeared. The loneliness never left. But he slowly learned how to live beside it instead of fighting against it. He created conversations in his mind. Sometimes he imagined speaking to his parents, sometimes to old friends. Sometimes he replayed ordinary moments from years earlier with remarkable detail. He could almost hear laughter, almost smell home-cooked meals, almost feel solid ground beneath his feet. Those memories became more than comfort. They became medicine. Whenever despair threatened to overwhelm him, he deliberately forced himself to remember another piece of his old life. He refused to allow the ocean to erase who he had been. Nature, however, continued testing him in new ways. Violent storms still arrived without warning. Towering waves crashed over the little boat, filling it with seawater within minutes. Every storm became another battle. For hours, sometimes an entire night, Alvarenga bailed water without stopping. If he rested too long, the boat could become too heavy and sink. There was no room for panic, only action. When the storms finally passed, he inspected the boat carefully. Tiny cracks worried him more than sharks. Loose equipment worried him more than hunger. He understood something terrifying. His greatest protection wasn't his strength. It was that fragile fiberglass hull floating beneath him. If the boat failed, everything ended. He treated it almost like another living companion. Every rope was secured. Every container was tied down. Every useful object had its place. Discipline became survival. One afternoon, while drifting through calm water, he noticed something extraordinary. A massive whale surfaced not far from the boat. Its enormous back rose silently from the ocean before disappearing again beneath the waves. Minutes later, another appeared, then another. For several hours, whales traveled through the same waters, occasionally surfacing close enough for him to hear the powerful sound of their breathing. Alvarenga remained perfectly still. The sight filled him with emotions he could barely describe. For the first time in months, he no longer felt completely alone. The animals paid him no attention. They simply continued their ancient migration across the Pacific. Yet their presence reminded him that life still existed beyond his tiny drifting world. Not every encounter brought comfort. Sharks remained constant companions. Sometimes several circled beneath the boat for hours. Whenever he leaned over the side to catch fish or clean equipment, he could see dark shapes gliding silently below. He learned never to enter the water, not for any reason, no matter how tempting it became during the unbearable heat. The boat was safety. The ocean belonged to everything else. As the months passed, Alvarenga also began noticing subtle changes in the currents. Floating debris appeared more frequently. Branches, leaves, coconuts, occasionally even pieces of plastic carried from places hundreds or thousands of miles away. Each object suggested something important. Land existed somewhere. The currents were carrying traces of it. He had no idea where, no idea how far away. But for the first time in a very long while, The Pacific itself seemed to be whispering that this endless journey might not last forever. It was only the smallest hint, barely enough to inspire hope. But after months alone on the open ocean, even the smallest sign could become a reason to survive another day. The small signs became impossible to ignore. For months, Jose Salvador Alvarenga had drifted through an endless world of nothing but water and sky. Every direction had looked identical. Every horizon had been empty. Now, the ocean was changing. It began with a single branch floating beside the boat, then another. A few days later, a cluster of leaves drifted past. Not long after that, he spotted an entire coconut. He immediately reached over the side and pulled it aboard. Holding it in his hands felt almost surreal. For months, everything he had touched had come from the sea. Fish, birds, turtles, salt water. Now, he was holding something that had clearly grown on land. He carefully broke the coconut open. The fresh liquid inside was unlike anything he had tasted in months. It wasn't simply food. It was proof. Somewhere beyond the horizon, there was land. He had no way of knowing whether it was 50 miles away or 500. Ocean currents often carry debris across enormous distances. Still, something inside him changed. Hope, which had been buried beneath endless routine, slowly began returning. He became even more alert. Every morning, instead of simply scanning the horizon, he carefully studied the direction of the drifting debris. He tried to understand the currents. He watched the birds more closely. Experienced fishermen know something important. Certain seabirds spend almost their entire lives over open water. Others return to land every evening. If he could identify which birds he was seeing, perhaps they would reveal what the ocean refused to show. One afternoon, he noticed several birds flying steadily in the same direction shortly before sunset. He watched them disappear into the distance. The next evening, the same thing happened. Again, the birds flew toward the same horizon. Alvarenga couldn't follow them. His boat had no engine, but the pattern gave him another reason to believe he might finally be drifting closer to civilization. His physical condition, however, remained alarming. Months of eating almost nothing but raw seafood had transformed his body. His muscles had wasted away. His ribs pressed visibly against his skin. Old wounds healed slowly. New ones appeared constantly. Standing too quickly often made him dizzy. Sometimes he collapsed back into the boat before his vision returned. Yet despite looking weaker than ever, his survival instincts had become astonishingly efficient. He wasted almost nothing. He understood exactly how long he could remain in the sun before exhaustion became dangerous. He knew which clouds were most likely to bring rain. He could catch flying fish with movements that had become almost automatic. Survival itself had become second nature. His greatest battle was no longer physical. It was mental. Some days he wondered whether returning home would even matter. Everyone probably believed he was dead. His family had likely mourned him months ago. Friends had surely continued living their lives. Would anyone still be waiting? Would anyone recognize the broken man the Pacific had created? Those thoughts frightened him, but they also reminded him of something precious. There was still a home to return to. One evening, while watching another breathtaking sunset, Alvarenga quietly made himself a promise. If I ever reach land, I'll never waste another ordinary day. He realized that the simple moments people overlook every day, a glass of clean water, a warm meal, a conversation, sleeping indoors during a storm, walking barefoot across solid ground, they were never ordinary at all. They were miracles. He simply hadn't understood it before. As darkness settled across the Pacific once again, another flock of birds crossed overhead. They flew confidently toward the western horizon. For the first time in many months, Jose Salvador Alvarenga smiled. Not because he knew rescue was near, but because the ocean had finally given him something it hadn't offered in a very long time, a reason to believe the journey might actually have an ending. The signs of land became more frequent. Every day, Jose Salvador Alvarenga noticed something new drifting beside his little boat. More branches, larger pieces of wood, clusters of leaves that still looked surprisingly green. Occasionally, entire coconuts floated past, carried by currents that had traveled unimaginable distances. The ocean itself seemed to be changing. Its deep, endless blue slowly gave way to lighter shades of turquoise. The waves felt different, less violent, less endless. After so many months, Alvarenga had developed an almost instinctive relationship with the Pacific. He couldn't explain it scientifically, but he sensed that something around him had changed. He prayed he wasn't imagining it. The mind, after such prolonged isolation, could create illusions powerful enough to feel completely real. He had experienced them before. There had been mornings when he was certain he heard engines, afternoons when distant clouds looked exactly like mountains, even nights when he believed he could hear people calling his name. Each time, reality crushed those hopes. So now he forced himself to remain cautious, believe nothing, observe everything. Then, one morning, something happened that no hallucination could produce. A bird landed directly on the edge of his boat. Unlike the seabirds he had grown accustomed to seeing, this one looked different. Its feathers were brighter, its behavior calmer. It seemed completely unafraid. The bird rested only for a few moments before taking flight again. But instead of disappearing randomly across the ocean, it flew in one clear direction, toward the southwest. Alvarenga watched until it vanished. Hours later, another bird, the same direction, then another. His heart began beating faster. Birds that nested on land rarely wandered endlessly across the open ocean. They traveled with purpose, and purpose usually meant home. For the rest of the day, he stared toward that section of the horizon. Nothing appeared. The following morning brought another surprise. The air smelled different. It was faint, almost impossible to notice. But after more than a year surrounded by nothing except salt water, he recognized it immediately. Vegetation. The scent was carried by the wind only occasionally, disappearing almost as quickly as it arrived. Still, it was real. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. For the first time in hundreds of days, the air carried something other than the ocean. Tears filled his eyes, not because he could see land. He still couldn't, but because his senses were telling him what his eyes could not. Somewhere nearby, life was growing. His emotions became difficult to control. He laughed, then cried, then laughed again. He spoke aloud to no one. "I'm close. I know I'm close." The Pacific had taught him not to celebrate too early. Yet hope was becoming impossible to suppress. That afternoon, another remarkable event unfolded. A floating log drifted past. Unlike every piece of debris he had seen before, this one carried tiny insects crawling across its bark. Insects, creatures that could never survive weeks drifting across the open Pacific, which meant only one thing. The log had entered the ocean recently. Very recently. Land couldn't be far away now. That night, Alvarenga barely slept. Every hour, he lifted his head and searched the darkness. The stars reflected across calm water. The gentle rocking of the boat felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in over 14 months, he wasn't dreaming about survival anymore. He was dreaming about arrival. And somewhere beyond the darkness, beyond the invisible horizon, an island was waiting. Neither Alvarenga nor the people living there had any idea that one of the most extraordinary survival stories in modern history was only days away from coming to an end. The morning began like hundreds of others before it. Jose Salvador Alvarenga opened his eyes to the familiar sound of gentle waves striking the side of the boat. For more than 14 months, every day had started exactly the same way. He stretched his aching body, scanned the horizon, and prepared himself for another day of survival. He expected nothing different. Then he froze. Far ahead, almost blending into the morning haze, was a dark shape unlike anything he had seen since leaving Mexico. At first, he didn't trust his own eyes. More than once, exhaustion had tricked him into believing clouds were mountains or waves were ships. He rubbed his eyes repeatedly. The shape remained. Slowly, it became clearer. Green, uneven, solid, land. For several long minutes, he simply stared in complete disbelief. His heart pounded so violently he could hear it over the sound of the ocean. After more than 400 days surrounded by nothing but water, the impossible had finally appeared. An island. He laughed. Then he cried. Then he fell to his knees inside the little fiberglass boat, unable to stop shaking. I made it. The words barely escaped his lips. I actually made it. But the journey wasn't over. Without an engine, he had no control over how quickly the currents would carry him toward shore. The island looked painfully close, yet hours passed before it seemed any larger. Every minute felt endless. He feared the current might suddenly change direction and pull him back into the open Pacific. He watched the waves obsessively. Little by little, the island grew. Individual trees became visible. Palm trees, dense vegetation, white sand. Everything he had dreamed about during endless nights at sea now stood directly before him. As he drifted closer, he noticed something even more extraordinary. Birds, not seabirds passing overhead, birds flying from tree to tree. The sounds reached him faintly across the water. It was the first time in over a year he had heard anything besides wind and waves. The emotion was overwhelming. His hands trembled so badly he struggled to steady himself. Eventually, the current carried the boat close enough for waves to push it against the coral reef surrounding the island. The impact jolted him forward. For a brief moment, panic returned. If the boat broke apart before he reached shore, everything could still be lost. Summoning the last reserves of strength hidden somewhere inside his exhausted body, Alvarenga climbed over the side. His legs immediately collapsed beneath him. They had forgotten what solid movement felt like. For months he had lived on a constantly shifting deck. Now the shallow water itself felt strange. He crawled, slowly, painfully. Each movement exhausted him. The beach seemed impossibly far away despite being only a short distance ahead. Finally, his hands touched wet sand. Real sand, not the fiberglass floor of a fishing boat, not floating debris. Solid ground. He pressed both palms into it and began crying uncontrollably. The earth beneath him felt almost unbelievable. He scooped handfuls of sand through his fingers again and again, as though afraid it might disappear if he let go. For several minutes, he simply lay there, listening, birds singing, leaves moving in the breeze, the gentle sound of waves breaking along the shore. Ordinary sounds. Sounds most people never even notice. For Jose Salvador Alvarenga, they were the most beautiful sounds he had ever heard. But he still had no idea where he was, or whether anyone lived on the island at all. His greatest battle had ended. A new chapter was about to begin. When Jose Salvador Alvarenga finally managed to stand, his legs shook so violently that he could barely remain upright. For more than 14 months, his body had adapted to the constant movement of a drifting boat. The solid ground beneath his feet felt almost foreign. Every muscle protested. His balance was gone. Even taking a few steps required an effort that once would have seemed effortless. He moved slowly across the beach. The island was breathtaking. Towering palm trees swayed gently in the breeze. Dense tropical vegetation stretched inland, and the air carried the rich scent of plants, flowers, and fresh earth. After breathing nothing but salty ocean air for so long, every breath felt almost overwhelming. His first instinct was simple: fresh water. He desperately needed fresh water that didn't depend on rainstorms. Following the sound of birds and insects deeper into the vegetation, he searched carefully until he discovered puddles of collected rainwater among rocks and plants. He drank cautiously at first, afraid his weakened stomach might reject too much too quickly. The cool water was unlike anything he had tasted since the nightmare began. For a long time, he simply sat beneath the shade of a tree, drinking little by little while tears rolled down his weathered face. He had survived, but survival had not yet become safety. He still didn't know where he was. The island appeared peaceful, but also seemed strangely quiet. There were no obvious roads, no buildings visible from the beach, no sounds of vehicles or machinery. Had he reached another deserted island? The thought terrified him. After surviving more than 400 days at sea, the idea of dying alone on land seemed almost unbearable. Gathering what little strength remained, Alvarenga continued walking. The dense vegetation made progress slow. Every branch scratched his already damaged skin. His bare feet, softened by months aboard the boat, struggled against rocks, roots, and rough ground. Then he heard something. Voices. At first, he stopped walking. He wondered whether exhaustion had created another illusion. He listened again. There they were, Human voices, real voices, speaking in the distance. His heart raced. He tried to shout. Only a weak, hoarse sound emerged. His throat had forgotten how to project words after months of speaking mostly to himself. He pushed forward through the vegetation until he finally saw them. A small house. Two people stood nearby. At first, they simply stared. The figure emerging from the trees hardly looked human. His beard reached his chest. His hair hung in tangled knots. His body was little more than skin stretched across bones. His clothes had almost completely disintegrated after endless months exposed to sun, rain, and salt water. For a brief moment, neither side moved. The islanders struggled to understand what they were seeing. Alvarenga struggled to believe other people actually existed. Finally, he raised one trembling hand. Help! The word barely escaped his lips. The couple immediately ran toward him. They spoke to him, but he understood almost nothing. They lived on Ebon Atoll, part of the Marshall Islands, thousands of miles from where his journey had begun. Their language was unfamiliar, yet no translation was necessary to understand what was happening. Compassion required no common language. They helped him sit down. They brought fresh water, then food. Alvarenga ate slowly, following their careful guidance. His body had become so fragile that eating too much too quickly could have been dangerous after such prolonged starvation. The islanders looked repeatedly toward the battered fishing boat resting near the reef, then back at the exhausted stranger sitting before them. One question filled every mind. Where had this man come from? Within hours, local authorities were contacted. News of mysterious survivors spread quickly across the remote islands. No one yet realized they were looking at the man who had drifted across nearly 7,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean. One of the greatest survival stories in modern history had finally reached another human being. The first photographs of Jose Salvador Alvarenga shocked everyone who saw them. Standing on Ebon Atoll in the Marshall Islands, he looked less like a fisherman and more like someone who had stepped out of another century. His hair fell far past his shoulders. His beard was thick and tangled. His skin had been burned and darkened by relentless exposure to the tropical sun. His body was frighteningly thin. Yet despite everything he had endured, he was standing, walking, talking, alive. Doctors who examined him were astonished. Given the length of time he claimed to have spent drifting across the Pacific Ocean, many expected catastrophic physical damage. Surprisingly, although he suffered from severe malnutrition, dehydration, swollen joints, skin damage, and extreme muscle loss, his vital organs had survived remarkably well. His body had adapted in ways few people thought possible. The greater challenge wasn't physical. It was psychological. For more than 14 months, Alvarenga had lived in complete isolation. He had spoken mostly to himself. He had survived by following routines that made sense only in the middle of the ocean. Now, suddenly surrounded by people again, the world felt overwhelming. Simple sounds startled him. Doors closing, multiple voices speaking at once, engines, electric lights. Even sleeping indoors felt strange. For months, his brain had become accustomed to falling asleep beneath an open sky while listening to waves. Silence no longer existed. As word of the mysterious survivors spread through the Marshall Islands, journalists and government officials quickly became interested. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Could his unbelievable story possibly be true? When Alvarenga finally explained that he had departed from the Pacific coast of Mexico more than 14 months earlier, many people struggled to believe him. The distance sounded impossible. Oceanographers, however, began studying the claim. They analyzed Pacific currents, wind patterns, weather records, storm data collected during the previous year. Slowly, an extraordinary picture began emerging. The currents he described matched the natural flow of the North Equatorial Current across the Pacific. The timing matched major storms recorded in late 2012. His descriptions of weather conditions aligned with historical meteorological data. Even the debris and wildlife he encountered corresponded remarkably well with what scientists expected along such a journey. What initially sounded unbelievable became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, authorities worked to confirm his identity. Eventually, contact was made with relatives in El Salvador. For them, The phone call seemed almost impossible to understand. Jose Salvador Alvarenga, alive? After more than a year? Most had already accepted that he had died somewhere in the Pacific. Some had mourned him. Some had prayed for him. Almost no one had expected another phone call. When his family finally saw photographs of him alive, many simply broke down in tears. The impossible had happened. The man they believed the ocean had taken forever had somehow returned. But not everyone accepted the story. As international media covered his survival, skeptics emerged. Some questioned the timeline. Others argued that no human being could survive that long under such conditions. A few even accused him of inventing the entire ordeal for attention. Those accusations deeply wounded Alvarenga. He had never asked to become famous. He had never wanted interviews. He had only wanted to survive. Still, investigators continued examining every detail. The evidence kept pointing in the same direction. Everything, from weather records to ocean currents and his physical condition, supported the possibility that the unimaginable had actually happened. One fisherman had crossed nearly an entire ocean without an engine, without navigation, without rescue, without giving up. And the world was only beginning to understand just how extraordinary that journey truly was. Today, years after that impossible journey began, Jose Salvador Alvarenga's story continues to inspire survival experts, psychologists, sailors, and ordinary people around the world. His voyage lasted approximately 438 days. He drifted nearly 7,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. He survived storms powerful enough to destroy fishing boats. He endured hunger that would have broken most people. He faced dehydration beneath an unforgiving tropical sun. He experienced a level of loneliness that very few human beings will ever truly understand. And somehow, he came home. His survival forced scientists to revisit assumptions about the limits of the human body. Medical specialists studied how prolonged starvation, dehydration, and isolation had affected him. Oceanographers examined the currents that carried his boat from the coast of Mexico to the Marshall Islands. Psychologists explored the extraordinary mental resilience that allowed him to continue choosing life after losing his companion and spending months completely alone. One lesson appeared again and again. Survival was never the result of a single miracle. It was a result of thousands of small decisions. One more fish caught, one more container filled with rainwater, one more sunrise endured, one more day refusing to surrender. Every tiny decision became another step toward life. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Alvarenga's story is that he was never trying to become a legend. He wasn't attempting to break a record. He wasn't searching for adventure. He was simply a fisherman who wanted to return home after an ordinary day of work. Life changed everything in a matter of hours. His experience reminds us that the greatest tests often arrive without warning. One ordinary morning can become the beginning of an extraordinary journey. And when that happens, we rarely discover our true strength immediately. We discover it one difficult day at a time. Alvarenga has often spoken about how deeply the experience changed him. The simple comforts that most people barely notice became priceless. A glass of clean water, a meal shared with family, sleeping safely beneath a roof during a storm, hearing another person's voice, watching children laugh, feeling solid ground beneath his feet. These were no longer ordinary moments. They were gifts. His story also reminds us of someone who should never be forgotten. Ezequiel Cordoba, the young fisherman who accepted one last-minute job, believing he would return home the following day. Although he did not survive the journey, his courage, his struggle, and the friendship he shared with Alvarenga became part of one of history's most extraordinary survival stories. His memory deserves to live alongside the man who finally reached shore. Even today, some people still question whether such a journey was possible. Healthy skepticism is understandable. The story sounds almost too incredible to believe. But extensive investigations, weather records, ocean current analysis, medical evaluations, and countless interviews have convinced many experts that the evidence supports what happened. Sometimes reality is more astonishing than fiction. Sometimes the greatest stories are not created by imagination. They are created by human determination. When everything familiar disappears, when hope becomes almost impossible to hold, when no one is left to encourage you except yourself, the decision to survive becomes the most powerful act a person can make. Perhaps that is why Jose Salvador Alvarenga's journey continues to resonate with millions of people around the world. Not because he conquered the ocean. No one truly conquers nature. He survived because he refused to surrender his will to live. And perhaps that quiet decision, repeated day after day for 438 unimaginable days, is the greatest act of courage in his entire story. If this remarkable true story moved you, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we remember the extraordinary men and women whose courage, sacrifice, and resilience deserve never to be forgotten, because history is filled with incredible people, and some of the greatest stories are the ones the world almost lost forever.